Okay, students, lecture 14 already. Hard to believe. I really like this background here. Look like it says, say goodbye to India, which is sad because, I like India. I think India is pretty cool. But I have this mountain that kind of looks like the Himalaya mountain here, and that's why I chose this background for this Prezi. Something else is, when we talked about China, I gave you like a good historic timeline for the development of early China. We talked about Islam. I gave you a good timeline for the history and the development of the early Islamic Empire. Haven't done that for India. India's been like this big conglomeration of philosophies and not much background into Indian history. So I'm going to try to right that wrong today with this presentation. And like I said, this is the last time we'll talk about India in the course. Some of you might be happy about it. I'm sad about it. Okay, 3 big questions about lecture 14. What's the Mauryan Empire? Who's Ashoka? And what's the Gupta Empire? So those are our questions, and we're going to dive right in. Here are the 3 timelines that you need to think about. The Mauryan Empire takes place from 322 to 184 BCE, and then it collapsed, and there was a period of feudalism. Now, you could compare this to the Warring States period in China, very similar, because not only was it a time of political chaos, it was a time of cultural advances, just like in China. And this takes place, for about 500 years. And then there's another short-lived empire for 200 years called the Gupta Empire. So those are the three time periods that we're going to be looking at. Okay, I want you to look at this character right here. His name is Chandragupta Maurya. And I should have put his picture all over this portion, but we'll come back to this picture in a few minutes. Here's his name, Chandragupta Maurya. And where he's from is a place called Magadha. That's hard to say, Magadha. And this province right here on the northeastern portion of the Indian subcontinent. So that's Chandragupta, that's where he lives. Now let's talk about Europe. Say what? One of the most significant people in all of history is a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. He lived from 356 to 323, and his impact on history is profound, baby. Now, some of you all took ancient history with Mr. Sturtevant. We talked about the Peloponnesian War in Greece between Athens and Sparta. And what made Greece very interesting was it was never unified. There were just all these independent city-states that had a common language and a common religion, but were very different in many ways. So after the Peloponnesian War, which devastated Greece, just to the north there's this province called Macedonia, and there's this young man called Alexander the Great who wants to unify the Greek peninsula, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and he pulls it off. Not only does he pull that off, but he creates this amazing empire in a very brief period of time, in just less than a decade. He comes pouring out of Greece and defeats Greece's traditional enemy, which is Persia, goes through Palestine into Greece. You ever wonder why there's a city called Alexandria in Egypt, just named after Alexander the Great? He destroys the Persian capital called Persepolis, and then pushes farther east to the Indus River and goes sliding into India. Now, we're talking about a clash of civilizations, a clash of worldviews on an epic proportion. Alexander the Great was a megalomaniac. The term megalomania comes from Greece. It just means full of ego, full of hubris. Believed that he could conquer the world. When he crosses the Indus River, the story goes as follows. He comes across an ascetic. Now, Alexander is really curious about this scraggly-looking guy, and this is probably all made up, but it's a great story. Walks up to it and says, what are you doing? And the ascetic looks up at him, opens his eyes, looks up at him, and he goes, I'm trying to give up the world. Then he has the audacity to look at Alexander the Great and says, what are you doing? And Alexander says, I'm trying to acquire the world. I am trying to take over the world. Now, both looked at each other like they were insane. It's just a classic case of not understanding the perspective of one another. Fascinating. Now, this is one of the greatest battles in world history. It's the Battle of Hadassah River in 326 BCE. Now, if you zoom in a little bit, what you're going to see is, Alexander the Great's campaign of conquest, 336 to 323. Right here is the Hadassah River. It's in northern Pakistan, very northwest corner of India today. And this is going to be the battle that Alexander's going to win, but come to the conclusion that this is far enough. I'm not going to push further. Now, what's wild about this battle is this battle was a battle, a clash of civilizations. The Indians met Alexander the Great with war elephants and foot archers. Foot archers are individuals that shoot arrows with their feet. They stick their leg way out and pull the bow back with their arms, and you could really get this incredible amount of velocity and power out of arrows that way. And so the Greeks were just shocked by how vicious the Indian soldiers were and their new tactics of fighting. And you don't really think of Indian soldiers as being these brutal, vicious soldiers, but in this case they were. Now, Alexander and his forces won this battle. It was a Pyrrhic victory. You know anything about Greek history? There was a battle between the Athenians and the Spartans at the place called Pyrrhic. The Spartans won. It was a victory at such high costs that they concluded the victory was not worth fighting. And these are pictures, obviously, of American caskets coming home from the war on terrorism. And so if you win a battle, but you lose so much in the process, you might look at it as not worth fighting. And what's crazy about this, get this, Alexander tried to venture no further into the Indian subcontinent after this battle. So it was a Pyrrhic victory. Now, there's a young man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya. I showed you his little statue before. And he was, he looked at Alexander the Great as the enemy, but he also looked at him as a role model. He goes, we need someone to do for Greece, do for India, what Alexander did for Greece. We need someone to come in and forcibly unify the entire Indian subcontinent, just like Alexander did. So Chandragupta is going to use him as a role model. He is going to, much like Alexander used Macedonia as his base of operation, he's going to use Magadha as his base of operations and spread out to the west and to the south and to the north and to the east. And he is going to put together an empire that's really quite amazing. Now, the Mauryan Empire, which he creates, within just a decade after fighting Alexander's forces, was the largest area ever unified under Hindu control. Today, this Pakistan is an Islamic country. There's never been an area larger. Now, I want you to think about something. 100 years after this, there's going to be a guy by the name of Shi Huangdi who's going to do the same thing in China. Under Chandragupta and his successors, internal and external trade and agricultural and economic activities all thrived and expanded across India thanks to the creation of a single and efficient system of finance and administration and security. Chandragupta defeated all attempts by Alexander's descendants to retake Pakistan. Tremendous source of pride in India today. He removed the Greeks from this area. But he's fascinating. And there we go. That's how big the empire was by 265. But his grandson is even more interesting than he is. Chandragupta's grandson was a man called Ashoka, who kind of looks like, I don't know, a sitcom mom or something. And some of you might recognize this symbol right here. It's on our shirts. It's on the Big Walnut University seal. It is the Wheel of Ashoka, which we'll talk about momentarily, the 24-spoke wheel of Ashoka. Now, Chandragupta defeated all attempts by Alexander's descendants to retake Pakistan, but he also his son, who took over after him, not Ashoka, Ashoka's father, was constantly at war with local people who tried to take over his power as well. Now there's a province just below Magadha called Kalinga. I know it's spelled differently here, but it's just below Magadha. And they were very rebellious in terms of this Chandragupta, Mauryan Empire. So here's what happens. It's not that complicated. You have some distant relatives that desperately want to be the successor. Ashoka, who is the grandson of Chandragupta, goes in there and wastes every daggone one of them. Now his father died in 273, and so he goes on a killing spree to eliminate every potential rival. And these relatives, many of which were his brothers, I mean, not like distant relatives. So he's going to brutally get rid of every potential rival, and this took place in this province of Kalinga. Now, Ashoka was brutal. You're going to read a little packet about him. This will make more sense after you've digested that. But he was known as cruel, Ashoka the cruel, Ashoka the brutal, Ashoka the bloodthirsty. There's Kalinga, and there's Magadha. Now, you may have seen this little image as you walked in. This is, wow. Ashoka would be considered like India's George Washington in many ways. Just watch this trailer about him, because what's going to happen is he is going to be this incredibly brutal warrior, but he's going to walk out onto the battlefield after he's killed all these people. He's going to see widows. He's going to see orphans. He's going to see piles of dead bodies, and he goes through this incredible transformation where he becomes ashamed of what he did. Check this out. We can get it going here. I hope. There we go. There's the spinning circle. So we'll try to get this going. Now he's a Hindu at this point. He's a tremendous warrior. No one can beat him. There he goes into battle. And now he walks out on the battlefield and realizes what he's done. Wow. Now here's what happened. He has an epic conversion. He goes from Hinduism to Siddhartha, the Buddha. And he changes overnight. Isn't that amazing? Now check this out. He becomes one of the most enlightened kings the world has ever seen. He spends on massive public works for the poor. Get this, people. He outlaws hunting for sport because he thinks you're allowed to hunt for food, not for sport. He thinks that's cruel. He encourages vegetarianism. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? In 300 BCE. He mandates religious tolerance for all. He institutes a system of universal health care. Are you kidding me? He erects stone pillars throughout the empire that advertise Ashoka's policies of tolerance and justice. And I love this image here because you have them holding the hands, meditating, and then below he was wielding a sword. So he's like the two sides of Ashoka. Wow. Now in India today, there's these things called rock edicts. He died in 232, my apologies, 232 BCE. And throughout India today, you can find these rock edicts which have inscriptions about his philosophies of tolerance and, just tolerance and good rules. There's a map of the existing rock edicts of Ashoka. There's a close-up of one. It's pretty blurry. You really can't see it that well. But here's something you have to understand, man. As soon as Ashoka died, as was the case with Shi Huangdi in China, the empire quickly dissolves. All right, now, the next period, feudalism, but cultural advances. This is kind of a short but interesting period. It's kind of like the Warring States period in China. It's a time period when, there was no political unity, but lots and lots of intellectual advances. And this was the time when the great Hindu epics were finally codified and written down. And of course we have the Mahabharata. And just to refresh your memory, this is Arjuna going into battle, in which he's going to be told to do his duty. And then this right here is the great Hindu epic called the Ramayana. This is Rama right here. And this is Hanuman right here bowing down to him. Some of you guys did your papers on that. Those two wonderful Hindu epics were created at this time. Now, there were a number of people who converted to Buddhism as a result of Ashoka, but he never forced that on anyone. Probably the most enduring legacy of this time period is the creation of the one true world language, and that's the numbers. We think of them as Arabic numbers, but actually they come from the Indian subcontinent. Okay, now the last thing we have to cover about India is this time period after this period of chaos from 320 to 550 called the Gupta Empire, or most like to call it the Golden Age of India. It's the time when India was incredibly advanced by world standards. Now this is where things get a little bizarre. Chandragupta Maurya was a ruler, say 500 years prior to this, but the next unifier of India was so enamored with his example, he took his name. So it's really confusing. Chandragupta Maurya is one dude, and then Chandragupta the First is the leader of something called the Gupta Empire, and this is a coin from his rule. And then you have his grandson, Chandragupta the Second. So this is a very important time period in the Gupta Empire. And if you look, it was not nearly as big as the Mauryan Empire, but it did contain most of the important parts of India, all along the Ganges River. It was a time, and this is very significant, when Hinduism pushed back against Buddhism. And Buddhism really started to disappear from the Indian subcontinent to a large extent. And one of the things that they did is they went back to the basics of Hinduism, particularly when it came to sex roles. This is a picture of an arranged marriage. That was very much a product of that time period. And then this is the worst aspect of this. This sexism came to extreme forms in the awful process called sati. Sati is when an Indian woman who loses her husband loses all reason for existence. And so at that point, she will commit suicide by throwing herself on the husband's funeral pyre. Don't think Mrs. Sturdivant is going to do that. And I think the chances are I'll probably die first. I mean, you know, man. Women, I mean, they share their feelings, hence they live longer. Dudes just keep it inside and just die. Okay, so sorry to say goodbye to India people. You've been a great audience.